Welcome back to another episode of Litigious. I am
Did
your
people see
host.
that?
Yes, it's
A
Scott
bug,
Peterson.
a bug attacked me.
Giovanna is here being attacked by bugs. We're going to just go ahead and keep that rolling.
Ew.
Reminder, this is the number one podcast for legal stories, discussion of legal issues in the news, and other things legal. And if you enjoy it, please like, subscribe, and follow. We are back with our, I guess, summer episode after a brief hiatus. We'll probably be on another brief hiatus because we've got some travel coming up. But I wanted to touch on a couple of stories that were recently in the news. And we can start with a story that's been hanging around for a while, but just received some headlines when E. Jean Carroll received $5.6 million payment from President Trump in a civil case where, if you recall, Mr. or President Trump was found liable for sexually abusing and defaming Miss Carroll in a New York courtroom. And this, well, this is one of those things that some people may be surprised that he paid the money, but when you look into it, it actually turns out that he actually paid the money into an account after the verdict, uh, which earned interest while the appeals were pending. So, he did the right thing in terms of paying and appealing and following the process, and ultimately she received the money. So, what do you have to say about it?
Yeah, so I think just to clarify, like there's two cases out there. So people might have also seen reference to an $83.3 million verdict that she also won. That is still in an appeal process. It has been upheld at certain appellate levels. And that's like on the purely defamation claim. So what happened was back in 2019, E. Jean Carroll came public with a sexual assault that she alleged occurred in the dressing room of Bergdorf's. Back in the 90s. And when she came out with this story and also a civil lawsuit, Trump called her, said it was a hoax and called her a liar. And these are those situations where we've talked about multiple times on this podcast where defending yourself can sometimes cross the line into defamation. And that's what happened here. So that is still floating out there. So it remains to be seen if he's going to have to pay this additional $83 million. But this was also in the news on the 5.6 million because what precipitated that payment is that the Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal. So he had exhausted the Second Circuit has I believe that the Second Circuit has affirmed both of these verdicts, but at the very least, the Second Circuit had affirmed the smaller one, that was also the one that included the actual finding of sexual abuse. So once you lose at the circuit level, your only place to go is the United States Supreme Court. And they refused to hear his appeal. And I think that was significant, not only because he had to pay the money, but there were issues of presidential immunity in these cases that did not go in his favor because these acts did not happen while he was the president. And that had been, also affirmed. So the court is also, kind of rejecting looking at that whole thing again, which has been an issue during his presidency. So, we'll see what happens with this other verdict, but certainly a win for her, and a little bit of closure on that to, get that payment.
Yeah, and just to note, the Supreme Court's decision declining his request to review this $5 million judgment, that was not there was not a written decision that included any reasoning or public dissents. The Supreme Court gets I can't even tell you how many applications for cert or to be heard annually, and often they just deny cert and de decline taking cases, and they often don't issue reasons behind it. And so that was sort of like a procedural, normal route, I would say. But it did result in him paying. So he's unhappy about it. He's griping about it, but he paid the money and he moved on to the next one. So
Yeah.
interesting. You know,
And just one little point that's kind of pertinent to our practice in New York. One of the sort of conspiracy theories that he has sort of suggested is that this all came about because New York opened the statute of limitations for a small window of time for first for children and then for adult survivors of sexual assault and abuse. And he has kind of put it out there in the universe that, this was basically done personally towards him. I actually think that it was done because of the clergy sexual abuse cases was one of the precipitating factors of that legislation. And I also think it's important for people if they're kind of listening to that and they're thinking, oh, maybe that's wrong or something. People should keep in mind that the statute of limitations and for assault in New York State is only 1 year. So it is not remotely beyond the realm of possibility and psychology and a million other things that people would not have, come forward about certain horrible things that happened to them, within a relatively brief, like 1 year statute of limitations. So kind of in fairness to, a lot of things that kind of happened maybe more in the past, that is something that, our state decided to do a few years ago and just kind of create this window where people could bring these lawsuits. And it doesn't mean you're going to be successful in the lawsuit, but E. Jean Carroll was successful in the lawsuit, and that's kind of how that came about, that it was so sort of removed in time from, when this happened.
Yeah, you often see plaintiffs in assault cases try to backdoor the claim in by asserting a claim of negligence as well, which has a 3-year statute of limitations in New York. Many of these cases, that's irrelevant because they were so far removed, including this one. But that is something that you do sometimes see. Yeah, so we'll talk about the other verdict and whether it's ultimately paid, which President Trump definitely uses the legal system more than probably any prior president, but it does seem that historically he has ultimately followed legal decisions when, after exhausting all of his options. So we'll see what happens if they continue to rule against him on the larger number, and if he ultimately ends up paying it. So, all right,
He's
moving on.
gonna sell that crypto, put
I
those
think that
$83
crypto
million
is,
in
yeah,
escrow,
that crypto might be worthless at this
or
point,
his
but
cell phones, the cell phone.
yeah. I'm sure he's not hurting. Moving on. We've been talking about this Baldoni Lively case forever. The It Ends With Us movie that resulted or led to lengthy litigation between the movie stars Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. This was basically resolved recently, which we talked about, I think, in the last episode, and is now back in the news because Blake Lively's attorneys have filed a request for attorney's fees in California after the case, asking for $8 million in fees, which we've done a little bit of math on this, back of the napkin math, and it works out to how many hours?
6,666.
7,000 hours. So, for context, that is,
Billing at $1,200 an hour.
yeah, a couple of things. So they put in their request, basically $1,200 an hour, which the average listener might think is ridiculous, but we know from experience that big firm and complex litigators, it's not unusual that they charge that much or more per hour. White shoe law firms in big cities, the attorneys are commanding north of 1,200 an hour, often granted for big institutional corporate clients. But when you make a fee request in a case like this, you ask for an hourly wage that you either often receive or to which you would be entitled based upon your expertise in that particular subject matter. So the $1,200 is one issue, and the second issue is 7,000 hours equates to roughly 3.3 years of billing 40 hours a week on the file every single week of the year. Now, granted, there are multiple attorneys, I think, so that does break down a little bit, but pretty big number, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think the hourly rate is outrageous, although a court might. But the time I think is unreasonable, or my prediction would be that the court finds that the time is unreasonable because just a little bit of backstory for people listening. This is very limited with respect to what she is being permitted to try to recover her attorney's fees for. And there is a California statute. Now, this is all happening in court in New York, but within this lawsuit, there was a defamation claim by Baldoni against Blake Lively for the sexual harassment allegations that she made against him. California has a law that protects victims of sexual abuse and sexual harassment from being sued for defamation in like a retaliatory claim. So, under that statute, if the victim successfully has the defamation claim dismissed as being privileged under that statute, they are entitled to recover their attorney's fees. So that is what happened in this case. But that was only one claim of many. And where I pause and feel that the number of hours worked and then the costs that they say that they incurred is also like in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for people listening, the costs are like when you have to hire an expert or when you have to pay for depositions or photocopies or whatever. It's all the expenses in the case. I don't see how that is possible if you narrow the attorney's fees and costs to this particular claim in the case, because say this was a very straightforward lawsuit and that was the only claim in the case. If you have a privilege under a statute or even under the common law that this defamation claim is illegal because of like the First Amendment or it's a litigation privilege or a bunch of other things, you could do that at the very beginning of the case. And the only work that you would be putting into the case is your legal research to write a motion. And that is it. So what I could tell, and I looked up their motion on the Pacer, is like they have all their like discovery and reviewing documents. And I assume there has to be expert. I don't see how it's possible to run up $400,000 in costs like without your experts, but you don't need an expert for that. So I think that when the court like narrows this down and tries to figure out what percentage of this time that you're claiming was actually devoted to this particular claim, I see that being very, very small because if you have a claim of privilege, you could literally have like a first-year associate write you a legal memo on how to get that claim dismissed and get rid of it. And they're billing like hundreds of hours for the top highest level partners in their firm. I don't see like a judge buying this.
Maybe this is a classic aim high and expect something less scenario. Maybe they're handling it like a
Well, sure.
negotiation,
Yeah, they
right?
probably put in all their attorney's fees for the whole case and we're like, okay, judge, you figure it out.
Yeah.
Which I don't think they're going to appreciate because I feel that this whole case has been like a pain in the neck for the judge.
Yeah.
And then Baldoni, I read this in an article. I didn't have a chance to look at his actual opposition to this, but in an article about his opposition, I thought they made like a compelling point, which was that the New York Times was also sued
Yeah.
by Baldoni for defamation. And that
Yeah.
claim was also dismissed as it probably should have been under the First Amendment. And they also made a claim for their attorney's fees. And the claim for their attorney's fees was like $150,000.
It was 181,000.
Okay, so less than $200,000 versus 8 million. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Hey, I've said this before. My mentor when I was a young lawyer used to always have a saying, which was everything's admissible unless somebody objects. So ask for what you want and see what happens, right? Maybe you get it. You're not going to get it if you don't ask for it. So, I
Yep.
guess it's a worthwhile effort, but I'm sure all the publicity around it isn't helping their argument at all. Normally when you try to put in a fee application or something like this, you sort of want it to just kind of float under the radar, have the judge consider it. Maybe the judge agrees, maybe the judge knocks it down a little bit, but in this case, you could see a judge knocking this down by 80%. I mean, if not more, who knows? Um, so
Yeah, I think if you narrow it to that claim, I don't see how there is any way that you would get anything remotely approaching what they've asked for.
yeah, I think that's
And
fair.
this is like a weird case for me because I feel like it's bad karma to Monday morning quarterback other lawyers. And clearly these are like obviously very high level, successful litigators. But I feel that everything that was done in this case painted their client in like the worst possible light. It's like, oh, this case finally settled. I went to the Met Gala. I looked pretty. I'm living my life. Oh, let's make an $8 million attorney fee application and get trashed in the press again. And then she didn't go to
Yep.
Taylor Swift's wedding. So,
Yeah.
you know, just
Oh, she didn't?
one hit after the other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we always say it. This is like, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, because they've gotten nothing but she's this Blake Lively, who I support in her ability to try to hold someone accountable for doing something wrong. We've talked about this many times. Sometimes there is some consideration to be made of how this is going to sort of impact you in your life and your career. And I have not seen her get a shred of good press about this litigation, and this is just one more thing. Like typically you would want to be putting when you settle your case, you want to put this all to bed.
Yeah,
um
100%.
and then I mean, again, like in the benefit of hindsight, you would potentially say, hey, in the context of our settlement, maybe you're going to agree to pay us X, Y, and Z attorney fee.
Oh,
Obviously,
that's the thing. They probably said pay us $8 million in attorney's fees, and they're like, yeah, go ahead and try to get that from the court.
yeah, well,
That's probably what happened.
that probably is what happened, but I don't think my prediction is that they are not getting $8 million.
Yeah, I think that's safe.
I'd be surprised if they got $1 million.
Yeah, yeah. All right. This will be a relatively short episode today. One more topic though. We've talked a couple of times about the fallout from the Charlie Kirk cases. There's another one in the news. This is the biggest settlement yet, arising out of comments made in the fallout of Charlie Kirk's assassination, shooting back in 2025. So in this case, a professor from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, she was an anthropology professor. She sued the school because 2 days after the shooting, she responded to a friend's post on Facebook, and in so doing called Kirk a disgusting psychopath and mentioned his wife and children, and then said, quote, "The world is better off without him in it," close quote. In response to that, a member of Congress from Tennessee, who prior to seeing her comment had already called for the termination of all employees working in public education who had criticized Charlie Kirk, was tagged in a social media post with a screenshot of her comments and responded, quote, "on it," close quote. The University of Tennessee then placed her on administrative leave, and she was fired in February of 2026 after having deleted her post, apologized for her words, and apparently met with university representatives. Apparently, when she was fired, she was just months short of earning tenure. So she files this lawsuit, and University of Tennessee agreed to pay her $1.9 million to settle the claim. And if she was fired in February of this year, that's a pretty quick turnaround for a settlement. It leads me to believe that I don't know if they did depositions, but they certainly didn't get anywhere near a trial that quickly. It seems to me that the university recognized that they had a problem. So a couple of things, and then you can kind of talk about it. The biggest thing to me here is, and we've talked about this multiple times, is these politicians who came out immediately after the fact and started calling for all kinds of firings for anyone who was critical or made comments about Kirk. I I'm not saying what she said was right, and we've talked about this many times, but s- calling for public universities to fire people for speech is like shooting yourself in the foot before these comments are even made. And it just sets you up for these kinds of lawsuits when somebody ultimately gets fired for saying something that is protected by the First Amendment. Is it fair to say?
Yeah, well, I think it's also just an example of, I think people sometimes need kind of a constant reminder that a politician can often say whatever they want with no consequences. So this congressperson comes along and tells public universities who are protected by the First Amendment, whose employees are protected by the First Amendment, to fire anyone who criticizes a public figure. You could be a first year law student and be like, I don't think you're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's so, they can say whatever they want. They're, pandering to their base. They're getting people fired up. And no one is thinking about 10 steps down the road that if you work, for a public entity, you have job protection in these situations. And all of the settlements that we've seen have been in the public education or public employee. I think we talked about one recently where somebody was like a sheriff or something like that. Um, it's all in that context. So when people say, oh, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, they're talking about private employees or, an owner of a business who's like, oh, we're not going to patronize your business anymore. But, the First Amendment does protect public entity or public employees to a certain extent. And then you have a problem. So it's just a reminder, as we've said many times, to kind of pause and think about the consequences and not necessarily capitulate. And I do think, even though we have talked about this a lot, it is relevant at this moment in time as well, because Lindsey Graham just passed away and Mitch McConnell is, we don't know, in the hospital, may or may not be, um, you know, coming out of the hospital. Like, we don't know what his situation is at this moment. And these are two sort of polarizing figures. And I have certainly seen people say things that are insensitive and critical of them. I have not quite seen the same backlash as I did when people were saying negative things about Charlie Kirk. So I don't know if people are just mentally exhausted and don't want to go through this whole rigmarole again of calling people out for saying something, ill of the dead, or if Charlie Kirk was just a, person unto himself that, people took that so personally, and that these other, are people are, maybe more elected officials and maybe people think they're more open to criticism or whatever. But I do think it's, it's just a reminder to just, you see something you don't like, you don't have to take a screenshot of it and send it to like your congressperson or to the person's employer. Like, you're going to set off a potential firestorm of problems that are not in proportion to somebody saying something that's offensive for, 2 seconds of your life.
Yep. Yep. And yeah, look, I mean, the First Amendment protects pretty much all political expression. It is noted that like some, public institutions do have some power to limit speech if the comments hinder their capacity to function. I think that's probably what they're trying to rely on here. But I think this is just overstep. Look, it's obviously overstepping. I mean, they settled the claim that fast. It's obvious to me that they recognize the risk. They recognize that this was a problem, and the case is settled. So I don't know, not much beyond that. These seem like they'll probably keep coming down, and they are getting more expensive. It certainly seems.
Yeah, well, the longer people are out of work, the more worthwhile,
Correct.
their claim is. So, if people got fired unlawfully and they haven't gotten a new job by this point, I think, we will see more, not only more settlements, but of more significant amounts of money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anything else you want to touch before we sign off for the
Um,
week?
I mean, the only last thing, just briefly, is there's been a couple in the news again, and we've gone way more in depth in this in prior podcasts, but ICE has killed two people in fleeing vehicles or allegedly fleeing vehicles in the last couple weeks. Especially the one that's getting a lot of attention is a young man in Maine who had his 3-year-old child and wife in the car with him, who was here, from what I understand, lawfully and was not the intended target of ICE to begin with, but was stopped and I don't know, he started driving away, wasn't supposed to. They shot into the car, they killed him, they had him on the ground, basically dying in front of his family, without medical attention. Um, I think this is very, I think, disconcerting that this is still happening. I did see that, is it Homeland Security? They put kind of a moratorium on ICE conducting traffic stops, because the issue, or one of the many issues with the fact that this keeps happening is this is not really like an ambiguous area of the law. Like, unless the person is actively trying to run you over, you're not supposed to shoot into a fleeing vehicle. That's like in the federal, guidelines on use of force. It's in Supreme Court cases. So this really should not be happening. And it's disturbing that it is. And I think, we always see sort of in response to that criticism, people say, oh, well, just comply or just do this or just do that. The bottom line is that you are supposed to survive an encounter of the police, even with the police, even if you are behaving badly.
Yeah.
And not everyone behaves exactly how they should and how we would like them to do in a high stress situation, or if they panic or whatever. And it's up to the law enforcement people to act within the parameters of the law. So I just, I thought it was sad, and I think also it's also a little bit sad that I think people are very like desensitized to this right now.
Agreed.
Because I haven't, I mean, I've certainly seen this getting coverage, but not to the extent that we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's a little bit sad.
Yeah, people become, I think desensitized is the right word. So,
So I just
yeah.
wanted to mention that if that's a topic that, people are interested in, we did do much more of a deep dive into that when there were the two cases in Minneapolis. We kind of went a little bit more in depth in what the law is.
Yeah, people should listen if they're interested because we talk a lot about the immunity issues and what that would look like in New York versus federal. Had it occurred in New York, which it didn't, neither did this. So, it's certainly worth a listen if it's a topic that you're interested in. Anything else on it you want to touch on?
No.
All right. If you have questions about any of this, reach out to us. You can reach us at Instagram at Litigious Podcast. Thank you for listening. We will be back again soon. We'll try to get another one in before we take a little bit of time off in early August. And we appreciate the support. Take care, everyone.